Morning, everyone. Welcome to the 7th Annual Michael R. Argetsinger Symposium. I'm Mark Steigerwald, the Director of the International Motor Racing Research Center. Our event is produced jointly with the cooperation of the Society of Automotive Historians and, of course, our many participants who make this event possible. Actually, the event began last night with the annual Real Wheel Film Festival, courtesy of Tom Schmay, and the event will continue for the next 2 days, today and tomorrow, with a reception following the event this afternoon from 6 to 8. Once again, we thank our host, Watkins Glen International, for the use of their wonderful media center. A couple of additional items, courtesy of Joe Freeman. We have a number of books from Racemaker Press for sale at the back of the room today and tomorrow. And I should take this opportunity to make my PBS speech. Membership is vital to the success of both of our organizations. People make the difference in organizations such as ours and make this event possible. The IMRRC is relying on membership, as is the SAH. More information can be followed at our respective websites, racingarchives.org and autohistory.org. With that said, I'll turn over the proceedings to historian and SAH Director Don Capps. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Mark. A couple of things. I'm going to have to do some administrative things for us. Today and tomorrow, we have a schedule. I know that in academia, schedules are kind of wimpy. We stay close, but when you're doing what we're doing now with hybrid, we need to pretty well stay on our schedules because we have people waiting for their cues to come on online. So we'll have to strictly hold ourselves to our time limits. When it's a 15-minute break, it's a 15-minute break. That sort of thing. Which brings me to a very touchy subject. Questions and answers. One of the things, if you're here, please keep your questions short and and to the point. If you're online, please use Duke at racingarchives.org. If you have a question for one of our speakers, who it is, bring it to our attention, and we'll take it directly to that person, or even someone who's present. So please hold yourselves to that. One of the other things that I think is very important to understand is that the Argetsinger, what we now call it, the Argetsinger Symposium, this is our 7th edition. And as Mark had just pointed out, we're very thankful for what Watkins Glen International has provided for us. The facilities has made a difference. All of you who were present here in the building and all of you who are out there in digital land, please support us. We want to be around for our 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. We need people to start thinking about articles to submit. We want you to please keep motor racing history alive. The important thing is good work, good history. Doesn't matter who writes it. So that's one of the things I want to make very clear. Okay, Bob, are we about ready? Okay. All righty. Our first presenter today is great friend, and that's the other thing. I'm going to have to keep the introduction short. Online, there is you can download the program with all the bios and so forth. Normally, I will talk 5 or 10 minutes about people. I can't do that today. So Tom was going to talk about West Virginia motorsports history. And so, Tom, we're waiting on you, so take it away.
Tom, if you want to go ahead and share your screen. We're a little ahead of schedule here, but that's okay.
How's the audio?
Very good, Tom. Ready to roll. All yours.
Great. Good morning, everyone. And I'm looking forward to talking with you today. We're the first session for this conference, and I have the privilege of having been a participant in past conferences, both in Watkins, Glen, and online. And it's been an honor and a privilege to do that. My name is Tom Adamich. I'm the president of Visiting Librarian Service, and I have been in that role for 30 years. I'm an archivist and a librarian and a vehicle historian. I've been a member of SAH since 1993. I've been a member of the National Association of Automobile Museums since 1998. And I say that because I'm a humble servant in that I've had the pleasure of getting to know many of you through this opportunity. This symposium has been one of the great opportunities to share information, particularly on motorsports, and it's interesting to have seen it evolved. I think I was not at the first presenter, not at the first symposium, but at the second one. So ever since then, I think this is my fifth opportunity to talk with you today. Today I'm going to talk about something that kind of is in line with some of my past presentations, in that what we're going to talk about is kind of the way that the common people, the populace, those folks that are the average people of life, what they do in motorsports. Some of my past presentations were based on that. If any of you were a participant in my Formula V presentation, that was one that really looked at that idea. I say that because as you go through and listen, and I'll try to go through pretty quickly so that we'll have enough time to talk or share information, but keep in mind that theme of the populace, the people, and some of the spirit that they have to make something out of nothing, to really, and particularly look at the time frame of the history of racing in West Virginia. You know, we're looking at starting in the early 20th century. So a lot of that is historically based, which I think reflects on the spirit of the individuals who were involved at that time and today. Here's a little rundown of the agenda that we have. We're going to look at some of those early years, and we're talking starting in the late teens and early 20s in the 20th century, and progressing through, particularly jumping forward then following World War II because of some of the issues that racing faced during the war. And so then we will focus on some of the good people, and I have a good person to focus on, Dave Kurtz, who is a representative of the spirit of West Virginia racing, and I'll get into some of those details about that. And then we'll just briefly talk about racing today in West Virginia and some of the future opportunities that may exist. I like to say that a lot of the people who are involved in racing in West Virginia are probably part of that camp that dealt with the fact that they were just in the right place at the right time and that history was on their side. And I think when you look back, you can say that a lot of this is very true. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well as we move forward through the presentation. Sorry about that. One of the most interesting parts of early racing was the fact that it took place in small venues. Sometimes they are venues that would not have been thought of as being appropriate. Some early racing took place on ball fields, and some very grassy areas that were available. And of course, any venues that were part of county fairs, and those activities were very popular early on. And so, as you can see from this photo, that the idea of racing on a harness racing track was very appealing, and it helped to really start the development of racetracks throughout West Virginia. And this one was at Shattuck Park in South Parkersburg. And as we go through, you'll see various regions of the state progressed at different times, and that part of the northern part of West Virginia, somewhat close to the Ohio border, really was one of the first areas that developed, probably because of that influence of Ohio and Pennsylvania in the geography. So another area, of course, the population center, for those of you who know West Virginia, still is based in Charleston, in the capital area. So it was a logical choice for development. And Dunbar, which is in that South Charleston area of the Metro Charleston area, was one of the biggest early tracks. And as you can see, they started probably in the mid-teens to have auto racing and motorcycles. And I include that because, again, our motorsports focus, we think of cars and we think of that vehicle type, but we want to always be cognizant of some of the other vehicle types that did evolve during that time, and the opportunities for racing and competition. As you can see, again, Dunbar was one of those early places, and it really, I think, speaks to the fact that there were opportunities for development beyond what had been a traditional harness racing track, and of course improvements were very much part of that. The fact that in this case at Dunbar, clay was brought in as a surface, and really giving the opportunity for the infrastructure to be developed, including grandstands and those spectator areas and participant areas. So, the pits and the spectator areas to be developed were also part of that progress. The later racing, as you went into the 20s and the early 30s, most of those open wheel type race cars that we were familiar with from that era then began to be the dominant vehicle type. Prior to that, most of the vehicles were modified passenger cars, and you'll see a trend back to that as we move on in the presentation. But the open wheel cars were very specialized and very much targeted toward very organized racing. And this was, again, the dominant racing type during that period. I jump forward to World War II because I think it's significant to say that the war did pause a lot of the racing events, and it was something that I think that after the war, the pent-up demand that did exist was really probably what gave the sport, especially in the state, that real catalyst to move forward and become extremely popular, especially for the working folks, for the people who were owned. There was a lot of manufacturing that did exist within the state, especially in that area on the Ohio and West Virginia border, and in the Charleston segment, and over into Huntington to the west, and eastern Kentucky. So again, keep that in mind because that really does have an influence on how racing and where racing took place. Now we can get into some of this idea of people taking, again, going back to that kind of modified stock car, what became a stock car type of racing, and the good people who were very ingenious and inventive to make something out of nothing. And as you'll see as we go through this part of the presentation, it's very interesting how that took place in the state. And as far as venues, the other parts of the state that, again, as populations and opportunities existed, they developed tracks. St. Albans became a big racing venue, as did Scottsfield and Gillen Park. Again, Parkersburg, that part of the state had a lot of industrial influence, as did Williamson, Glenboro, and Pennsboro. Pennsboro being a location in Ritchie County, which is in that region. And then as you went west to Wellsburg and Weston, and then further west into the areas of Morgantown, which had a big steel area that not a lot of people know about, but definitely connected to its influence from Pittsburgh and that part of the state. But I mention that because as we get into some of these locations, you'll see how some of that post-war opportunity influenced the development. And I mention this again, these are some of these locations. Notably, that Evans being one of the first tracks to have lights back in 1947. So again, they were putting resources into these venues, and they became very popular during the time. This is a good picture from Pennsboro, and as you can see, the area was still very rural, but it did have, and a lot of these tracks were those original harness racing tracks that also served multiple purposes. This is the first slide I want to show you about Dave Kurtz. I had the pleasure of meeting him and his lovely wife and talking with them personally. I worked briefly for the state of West Virginia for the Library Commission, and I drove from Charleston over. They lived in Weston, so I drove east on 79 to visit them. It was a really neat time because I think Mr. Kurtz really represents that person who could, again, make something out of nothing, and really some of the things that he did were just very interesting and inventive, and I think represented the common people and what they were trying to do and accomplish in the sport. He started racing at age 17. He actually had to get a note from his mother because he was underage. And so you can think back and look at some of the things today, and that's kind of an interesting juxtaposition that somebody had to go through that. But there again, I think people were very industrious and inventive, as they are today. So young people find a way, and he did. And he, again, was in that area of near Clarksburg and that Martinsburg area. So he enjoyed racing at Norwood Park, which was in Clarksburg, and then at the Pennsboro Rice Speedway, which is in Shinston, and some of the areas in that region, including Eldora Raceway in Fairmont. So you get to learn a lot about geography of West Virginia, which for any of you that have been there, it is God's country because of its many little valleys and hollers, as the natives call it, and river bottoms and things like that that really give it its unique character, and it's just a good way to learn not only about racing but about where the people lived and what they did. So again, here's part of the text from the note that his mother wrote, and he was part of that Central West Virginia Racing Association organization that developed. And there were several of those throughout the state that were the oversight bodies for the sport. This is the part I always enjoy. You know, he was able to take a football helmet and some pipe and bale wire that he had around to make that roll cage that he used, and used the Army pistol belt that he had worn when he was in the war, or not him, but a family member was in the war. And so he later went to overseas to Korea and to Germany. So, but he did have family members that were in World War II. And so that was another interesting part of his life, and how he incorporated that. They went around, they bought old cars from people. One story, they bought a car from an old lady, and it's a really interesting story. This lady, and Onego is in Pendleton County, so it's kind of that going east, as you would be going toward that part of the state. They found this car, and the lady, she was an older lady, and said, "Here it is. I don't have a title on it. I'll sell it to you." Of course, it was one that had been sitting outside, and the bees got into it. So, his friend that he went with was kind of in that position of dealing with it. But there again, just kind of some neat things that happened to the people as they were trying to create their team, trying to create their racing opportunities that were presenting themselves. And I go back and I reference his wife Pauline, because she was just the nicest lady, God bless her. And she really, as far as somebody who was industrious, she was just as industrious as he was, to be able to help him. She was part of that, the ladies that helped, and she even helped in the pits when she could. Again, this was back in the day when the ladies weren't allowed to be working there, but she was able to go in there every once in a while, and if he needed something, she would do, just as much work as he was doing. And of course, when they were off track, she did a lot of that too. The other part of that I thought was interesting was this idea, that they decided when he was going to retire when she had her first baby. So this part of the story, there again, she was pregnant, so he was, honored his word, but by golly, he got drawn into a race and won the money. And she was able to, then they were able to use that money for the birth of their first daughter. So just one of those things that is in the right place at the right time, I think, and represents kind of that spirit of the sport, and why racing is still popular with people, because I think it does represent, that common interest and so on. And this is a really good picture of the couple that he was a car collector. As you can see, she passed away just shortly after, a few years after I talked with them. And then Dave passed away in 2019. So it's kind of a memory trip down memory lane for me, that it was such a nice trip out to talk with them. And I wrote an article that appeared in the state magazine Golden Seal, as a result of that. These are good pictures of again, Dave and his friends. This was his friend Ed Hitt that worked with him. So just a really, a good time, and how the people were just part of that community that formed and the culture that formed in the state. These are some of the pictures of crowds and some of the, what people did and how they were able to, again, very, very basic, but very interesting. And you can see the whole geographical influence of racing too, and how that impacted. Again, thank goodness he had that roll cage, because he was not immune to having rollovers and things happen to him. No injuries, but as you can see, to the right, he's already up and about. So Dave was a resourceful gentleman, so he did all right. And again, here's some friends of his that were part of that early racing group. That these were people. Monty Ward, in particular, was a big, very successful racer during that time. And these people represented throughout the state of West Virginia, represented the different regions of the state. And as I mentioned earlier, other parts of the state developed at different times, but even around Morgantown, that became a very popular venue for racing. And it was interesting that Dave got involved in some product testing for NASCAR, that he was part of that initiative for Monty Ward, as you saw him in that last slide. And then he went on and raced in those early races and venues that we're familiar with as far as NASCAR is concerned. Today, there's been a lot of activity at the legislative level, and that took place even when I was in the state, and the government, the people in Charleston were trying to promote it, and they had a motorsports commission developed during that time. But this is the latest iteration of the West Virginia Motorsports Committee, and again, the emphasis is not only on auto racing, but it does involve a lot of other types of vehicle racing and motocross and those types of activities. So they promote the different areas that they are, and these are the dedicated facilities that exist today. The areas that are dedicated to track racing, but also this Hatfield McCoy Trail, which is a very interesting. If any of you have an inclination to learn more about that, please let me know, because it's a very interesting development. So, and I think it really lends itself to that kind of the types of vehicles that are on there. Typically, and its relationship to people enjoying the sports and what it develops and how they can participate. And as you can see, it has evolved a bit. It's a little bit more technologically advanced and a little bit more expensive to, some of those people have to invest a good amount of money. But there again, the intent and the idea is to enable people to enjoy and participate, and they're historically able to do so. So again, looking at timeframes, history, without that context of what the history is at the time, sometimes we miss what really is there. And in this case, we have to look at today and see what our economic conditions are and some of that to really get a sense of today's activities. It continues to be a story that evolves and one that will continue to require making improvements and things that will be part of that as the industry continues to develop. And as you can see, there is always a reference, and that particularly when this was, in the early 2000s, there was that big move to try to have a track NASCAR venue set up in the state. And I think there's still some movement there, not as much as it was, but there's always that interest in having some type of influence NASCAR-wise in the state. So we'll see where that comes. And again, just a lot of good people that live there, and they're just friendly folks. You all come, they're very welcoming in that sense, and so they do represent motorsports very well in that regard, and that populist view. These are some of the sources again, and I encourage you to look at the West Virginia Encyclopedia if you'd like to go online. I'm happy to provide this deck for you if you're interested, and to answer any questions. And I had a lot of good help from people, the folks from the West Virginia Encyclopedia and from Golden Seal, who are very much part of that. The Humanities Council in West Virginia, and very eager to share information and promote the good things that West Virginia has to offer. And here's my contact information. And again, I'm happy to talk with any of you, and hopefully, God willing, that we can meet again in the future. And I'll open things up to questions, and we can certainly do that.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom, once again. Any questions here in the audience? I enjoy it. West Virginia has a very interesting racing history, and I think Tom covered a lot of that. So I think there's a hint to some of you. There's a lot to be covered by racing historians about West Virginia. And Tom, I think you've provided a nice framework for looking into it, because I think it's one of those types of situations where it kind of gets overlooked. There's a lot there, and I think a lot of connections. So thank you so much, Tom. Appreciate it. Thank you. Now, something that I had overlooked, and it's my fault. We have a group that I look forward to every year of being here. Alfred State University. Please stand. This has been a wonderful group. We all have always to bring a good crowd, and we appreciate that. So thank you for being here. It makes all this worthwhile. Thank you so much. Now, interesting, we have Alfred State. We have representatives today, back from last year, as a matter of fact, from Belmont Abbey. Where are you? There he is. So, and this year, we get the trifecta. We have McPherson College. So we have hitting the youth market. Yay. And that, to me, is very important. But there's another group. Dan and Buzz from the NASCAR Hall of Fame Museum. They're here, great friends. We've known them forever and ever. So you can see this is a pretty interesting crowd and situation we have here. we're spreading out, and that's just the surface. We want to spread more and more and more, get more people interested in this. Very interesting aspect of cultural history, sport history, automotive history. It's this confluence that we're getting. Now, yes, Bob?
Any other questions for Tom Adamich?
Yeah,
Anyone?
I have one.
Okay,
It's a
Tom,
very
we have a
obvious
question
one.
for you.
Tom, what in the world possessed you to look into this topic?
Tom, what in the world possessed you to look into this topic? I think I know the answer, but go ahead.
Well, I have to say, again, that whole populist idea and the understanding that racing really is that kind of grassroots type of activity, even in its upper echelons as it becomes that business model. And I think there's still that local aspect of people getting together, that people enjoy vehicles, they enjoy, the mechanical aspect of creating something out of nothing, and they still do it, believe me. Even where I live in Ohio, there's still, these small tracks all over the place where people get together and they have modified stocks and all those things. It's just amazing. And the young kids, it's just, that's what's heartening, that a lot of these kids learn skills and they're still doing it. So I think that was the part. And of course, my connection, the time that I did work in West Virginia, and I met a lot of good people, and just the idea that wanting to know what did it look like at different times in the state, and to be really, it's somewhat surprised at times that the area had such a very successful, and still does, a very successful racing climate.
Thank you, Tom, for the presentation, and we're looking forward to having you come back in the future. Thank you so much for that.
Okay, Tom,
Okay.
thank you much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay,
Take care.
you too.
Our next presenter has a topic that's, I think, pretty interesting. Good friend of mine for many years now, Professor Mark Howell, is going to talk about something that got my attention. Racing to the moon, NASCAR in space. So, Mark, it's yours.
Thank you, Don. I love having tech support. I wish I had this when I was in my classroom.
I wouldn't
teaching.
necessarily call this tech support yet.
I always had to fend for myself in the classroom.
Okay. You okay there?
Yeah.
You miss yourself?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, you need that? All right. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's good to be here. Good to see everyone. I was really surprised when I pulled in this morning. I have never seen the lot here so filled with cars for one of our sessions. It was very exciting to see that. So with that, this is part of a project that's been ongoing, and it's started off as kind of a vanity project because I grew up following the space program, like everybody else, wanting to be an astronaut, and then realizing I just didn't have the right stuff, as they say. I have applied to be an astronaut, but I was turned down. Fancy that. But then my interest in motorsports and growing up around motorsports. So I saw a connection between the manned space program and motor racing, and I started doing some research, and that was probably 5 or 6 years ago. This thing has really kind of, as I said, taken a life of its own. So with that, we will get into this. I've got some video, so bear with me. I've got just a few couple of minute passages there, that clips that we can look at. But so we'll proceed as we are here. My mother, Virginia, loved 3 things: her family, naturally. NASCAR competition. She was a huge NASCAR fan. And the music of Vaughn Monroe, the band leader with a baritone voice and a catalog of hit recordings that included the famous 1941 tune, Racing with the Moon. Little did anyone guess that at some point stock cars and this World War II era song would collide in a form of corporate and technological kind of connection in 2023. It was this past April when Leidos, a Virginia-based high-tech engineering and design firm serving the defense, health, and intelligence sectors, announced its technical affiliation with NASCAR, a statement coming just as the sanctioning body began celebrating its 75th anniversary in sports. Their partnership ultimately resulted in a next-gen lunar terrain vehicle, or LTV, for NASA's return to the moon through its impending Artemis program. The Leidos NASCAR LTV debuted in Colorado at the Space Foundation's 38th Space Symposium, and this is a clip from the unveiling. And I should be able to play this, I'm guessing, or is that something that you all have to do? Can I play the clip, or does that have to be? Let's see, I'm not getting a prompt. Let me see, let me just...
Hi, everybody. I'm Jonathan Pettis, Senior Vice President for Aerospace, Civil, and Defense at Leidos. And again, thank you all for being here, and thanks to Pete for being here. We're super excited about this partnership. I think the goals and the themes and the emphasis areas that NASCAR has for the future are shared greatly with what NASA's pursuing and what we're proud. One of the reasons we're so proud to partner with NASA on the Artemis program. And as you have a chance during the next couple of days to visit our booth, you'll see a wide variety of things we're doing in the space world, but obviously several different roles in the Artemis campaign. We couldn't be more proud to be part of that. From a NASCAR partnership perspective, their deep experience and capability in developing high-performance vehicles in harsh environments is something that obviously can play a great deal can help us a great deal as we engineer this vehicle. And so we're looking forward to tapping into that talent. For example, the most recent effort they've had in designing their next-gen race car, if you look at some of the principles that they used to develop that new vehicle, they're shared with some of the criteria and principles that NASA needs for a sustainable lunar terrain vehicle. In terms of the focus on fast and agile maintenance, agile replacement of parts, designing for maintainability, who could be better at that problem than an organization that has to focus on high-speed maintenance and pit stops? And so taking that innovation and their experience in that, we think is really important to how we want to approach this problem, again, to develop a safe and sustainable vehicle. And then finally, NASCAR is very good at connecting sponsors. And we are excited about what that may mean in terms of our commercial plans for the future and how we can leverage their expertise relative to our commercial pursuits. We think there's a lot of opportunity there, and so we're super excited about that. So without further ado, I think we have Steve and Pete in pole position here. So ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you the Leidos NASCAR Lunar Terrain Vehicle.
Leidos sought out NASCAR in part, as you heard, because of the organization's development and implementation of its next-gen Cup Series race car. This version of stock car has been in use since 2022, and it continues the tradition of NASCAR's somewhat creative interpretation of the term stock. The next gen, or Gen 7 car, is what you might call a spec vehicle. Cars are built according to a rigid set of guidelines using specially manufactured components sold to teams by NASCAR-approved companies. Using standardized parts and pieces registered with an official UPC is intended, theoretically at least, to lower costs and eliminate advantages enjoyed by better equipped teams. Next-gen cars use chassis built by a single supplier with, I don't know why it's backing up like that, with standardized front and rear clips for consistency, ease of replacement, and safety. We saw this system in operation last season when NASCAR re-engineered rear clips after Alex Bowman and Kurt Busch were both injured in rear-end collisions when impact energy was transferred into the cockpits of their cars, so much to the point that Busch actually had to retire from competition because of his injuries. The next-gen Cup Series cars also run composite body panels that are easier to use, easier to maintain, and more difficult to massage, shall we say, into an advantageous shape. A forward-thinking feature of the next-gen Cup car is its ability to accommodate hybrid technology. The car runs on 18-inch wheels that allow not only for larger brakes, but for the addition of regenerative equipment as well. As the automobile industry looks to both hybrid and fully electric vehicles, so too does NASCAR. It's given its emphasis on consistent components and energy conservation. Maybe it's no wonder that a cutting-edge systems development firm like Leidos came calling. Leidos Dynetics, the aerospace division of Leidos, also forged relationships with recognized motor racing entities like Roush Industries and Moog Suspension Components, both of which have long-standing ties to NASCAR. A key element of these partnerships is NASCAR's ability to develop, quote, high-performance vehicles for harsh environments, as you heard the Leidos executives say in the press conference. A far more interesting notion, however, is NASCAR's ability to attract corporate and industry sponsors. You also heard that comment made, especially as modern space exploration becomes privatized and commercialized. Leidos was founded in 1969 and today is a Fortune 500 company boasting a little over 46,000 employees. The firm began as Science Applications Incorporated with initial clients like Los Alamos National Laboratory and the Air Force Weapons Laboratory. SAI supervised the cleanup at 3 Mile Island in 1979. I went to graduate school right across the river from 3 Mile Island. You could see it from the parking lot at the college when you were leaving campus. The company also helped engineer the boat Stars and Stripes to victory in the America's Cup in 1987. In 2013, SAI split into a next generation of sorts of SAI and a new firm called Leidos. Leidos fosters a corporate culture of diversity, equality, and inclusion, or DEI. The company became a primary sponsor of Bubba Wallace's number 23 NASCAR Cup Series Toyota Camry in 2022. In the words of Leidos CEO Roger Crone, and I quote, "Bubba's efforts have paved the way for real change while advancing a culture of inclusion and diversity in NASCAR and across the world. We see this as much more than a sponsorship. It's an opportunity to showcase our shared values. We are proud to have Bubba Wallace representing Leidos both on and off the track." Bubba Wallace represented Leidos in April at the unveiling of its prototype lunar terrain vehicle, a project seeking a NASA contract for the Artemis program. The Artemis program is a good match for Leidos, given the program's attention to DEI initiatives and guidelines. The first lunar orbital mission, which is scheduled for 2025, will carry both a female astronaut and an astronaut of color. The same demographic NASA wants when astronauts return to the moon's surface in the years to come. Accommodating the size of a female astronaut was part of Leidos' initial LTV planning, but other factors were considered as well. Those other factors were where NASCAR came in. Leidos considered NASCAR given the organization's 75-year history of innovation and adaptability to all manner of extreme situations. Now granted, a Sunday afternoon at Martinsville or Michigan isn't nearly as challenging on a vehicle as a Sunday afternoon on the moon, but the folks at Leidos weren't about to quibble. Partnering with NASCAR during its Diamond Jubilee is about more than just winning a NASA contract. The partnership between Leidos and NASCAR is a most interesting affiliation. While Leidos recognizes NASCAR for its innovative approach to Cup Series racing, NASCAR recognizes Leidos as a corporate entity backing not only the sport's foray into interesting new markets like the Chicago street race, but also a team co-owned by perhaps the greatest basketball player in the game's history, Michael Jordan, by the way, if you didn't know. What Leidos and NASCAR provide are not only new opportunities in motorsports, but also technological opportunities that harken back to the days of the Cold War. America's space race with the Russians got off to a rough start in the early 1960s, but Uncle Sam got her dialed in by the end of the decade. Oops, I'm sorry, this is a different kind of advancing mechanism here. When Apollo 8 reached lunar orbit in 1968, and when Apollo 11 reached the moon's surface in 1969, the race was over. Those successes, ironically, led to the demise of future Apollo missions. With only 6 lunar flights remaining on what became a reduced schedule, NASA had to work smarter, not harder. Say hello to the Lunar Roving Vehicle, the most technologically interesting and aesthetically pragmatic machine ever built. General Motors teamed with Boeing and Goodyear to develop the golf cart-sized, all-electric, all-wheel drive, 2-seater with both front and rear steering, just like a monster truck, capable of hauling about 1,000 pounds at 6 miles an hour, a total distance of 40 miles. Made from aluminum, fiberglass, and Kapton for thermal protection, and with wheels fashioned from flexible woven wire mesh, the LRV folded to fit in the descent stage of the lunar module. The vehicle could be unloaded and assembled by 2 astronauts in 1/6 Earth's gravity in about 10 minutes. The LRVs on Apollo 15, 16, and 17 enabled astronauts to explore terrain far away from their lunar modules. The LRVs also enabled astronauts to explore their innermost competitive natures. Mission commanders, who began as military test pilots cut from the same genetic cloth as race car drivers, pushed these moon buggies to their mechanical limits. Apollo 15's Dave Scott, pictured here, drove the first Grand Prix, as it was called, and reached a top speed of 6 miles an hour before the rear wheels lost traction and his LRV started to slide. John Young, commander of Apollo 16, reached about 6 miles an hour as well before his rear wheels likewise lost a grip and slid. And here is NASA footage of John Young doing his Grand Prix in 1972. If I can get this to play. There we go. I think it's playing. just played by touching the... Oh, there we go. That sounded promising.
Okay, I'm ready. I'm not going to break it. Let me up to anything. That's all, Mark. That max acceleration? No. Man, you are really bouncing. Is he on the ground at all? That's 10 kilometers. Huh? He's got about 2 wheels on the ground. He's a big rooster tail out of all 4 wheels. And as he turns, he skids. The back end breaks loose just like on snow. Come on back, John. Hey, the deck is running.
That's Charlie Duke, the module pilot. He's doing the filming.
Man, I'll tell you, Indy's never seen a driver like this.
He caught that. He says Indy's never seen a driver quite like this. So another Motorsports reference.
Okay, when he hits the craters and starts bouncing is when he gets his rooster tail. He makes sharp turns. Hey, that was a good stop. Those wheels just locked. Mark off. Okay. Do you want to do it one more time? Yeah. Got about a minute, 5 seconds that time. Mark on. Okay, you could have gone the other way. Go ahead. There's the big craters there, though, aren't they? Yeah, I know. Yeah. One of those holes. They want 4 minutes worth, John. Well, it's 1 minute and 5. Maybe you can do it twice more. Surely. Okay, turn sharp. I have no desire to turn sharp. Okay, here's a Sharpie. Hey, that's great. Man, those things, when those wheels really dig in, John, when you turn, it's when you get the rooster tail. The suspension system on that thing is fantastic.
That sounds good. We sound like we've probably got enough of the Grand Prix. We're willing to let you go on from here. Call that a Grand Prix.
Okay. Man, that was all 4 wheels off the ground there. Okay, max stop. Okay, I don't want to do that. Okay, excuse me. They say that's a no-no. Okay, deck off, Mark.
Charlie Duke, who you heard narrating the Grand Prix there, also on a couple of occasions enthusiastically compared John Young to racing legend Barney Oldfield, making 2 distinct references to America's Speed King during recorded EVA communications with flight controllers in Houston. At one point, actually, they didn't know who he was talking about, so then he had to explain in kind of an aside who Barney Oldfield was. And once he explained it, then everything was okay. Oops. Again, I apologize for the advancing here. There we go. During Apollo 17, Commander Gene Cernan did what any truly competitive racer would do and simply reinterpreted the rules of the event. His Grand Prix resulted in a top speed of 11.2 miles per hour, but only because he ran a downhill route. Cernan's LRV record has stood for more than 50 years. But who's to say the 2023 Leidos NASCAR LTV won't shatter Cernan's 1972 mark? Preliminary data suggests the new vehicle will have a top speed of 9.3 miles per hour and a gradability of more than 20 degrees. Add a female astronaut and a downhill route, and it's likely NASCAR will be truly renowned for what it brought to the project. A competitive focus based on next-gen inspired design principles like fast and agile maintenance that are also useful for a lunar rover, as we heard during the press conference. An old-school NASCAR mindset was necessary when it came to fast and agile maintenance on the Apollo LRVs. On Apollo 17, an errant rock hammer broke the right rear fender, causing thick clouds of moon dust to cover the astronauts and all of their sensitive equipment. Gene Cernan made a quick repair using lunar maps, duct tape, and clamps. building a replacement fender and earning himself lifetime membership in the Auto Body Association of America in the process. We used to see spur-of-the-moment, seat-of-the-pants problem solving like this in NASCAR all the time, but the standardized and compartmentalized nature of the next-gen Cup car has turned creative thinking into more of a remove and replace reality. Despite all of this, Leidos still waxes romantically about the NASCAR of old. Here's a video the company released recently on YouTube within about the last 3 weeks or so.
Today's news. President Kennedy, in a speech at Rice University, committed the United States to being the first nation to put a man on the moon.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept.
Not because it's easy.
Ignition sequence starts. 3, 2, 1. We have a liftoff.
Throughout our history, we move forward from advancements in engineering to pushing the limits of what we once deemed impossible. Forward isn't just our trajectory, it's the whole point.
He's running flat out.
Houston, the Eagle has landed.
We are the champions, yes!
We choose to move forward, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. From breaking the barriers of speed to shattering glass ceilings for those whose guts and determination move us past our limits to unimagined heights. Our history is one of innovation and ingenuity.
We have felt the ground shake and the air shattered.
After all, always forward has no limits.
Any questions? All right, let me leave you with this. We do this. We choose to go to the moon. Not because it's easy, because it's hard.
We choose to go to the moon.
Okay, I'm just going to do a little editorial aside here. If you'll notice, under diversity and equality, they show a picture of Danica Patrick. To me, if I were on the creative team, I would have had footage of Janet Guthrie, because Janet Guthrie was actually an aerospace engineer and actually knew her way around the inner workings of a car, and she was a woman. Danica Patrick, I think now she just does podcasts that are like conspiracy theory things. So I don't know, just an editorial aside there. I will move on now. Okay. The relationship Leidos has developed with NASCAR is twofold. One aspect of the partnership focuses on more recent NASCAR innovations, not just the next-gen car, but also this past summer's Garage 56 NASCAR by way of IMSA project we saw at Le Mans. The other aspect celebrates NASCAR's socio-cultural and almost mythic connection to American automobile history, seen here in Kyle Busch's Toyota Camry. Leidos sees NASCAR as a celebration of grassroots ingenuity and what we cultural historians often refer to as rugged determination or individualism, achieving success according to your dreams, your goals, and your work ethic. As I see it, Leidos is relying on particularly strategic language and particularly specific historical narratives, including President Kennedy's 1962 speech at Rice University, to validate its technical and professional affiliation with NASCAR while trying to earn NASA's contractual approval. The Artemis LTV competition is down to a handful of aerospace automotive affiliations, including partnerships between Lockheed Martin and General Motors, Teledyne, Toyota, and Bridgestone, and Northrop Grumman with Michelin. Since NASCAR hopes to award the LTV contract to its chosen recipient by the end of this month, NASCAR finds itself squarely in the middle of a closely watched, competitive, and entirely next-gen race to the moon. And with that, I thank you for your time and your attention, and I'll take whatever questions folks might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I don't know how you do it, but you keep topping your previous ones. That's amazing. Okay, questions, please.
What happened to the vehicles? Are they still on the moon? And are they workable? Or
that's a good question. There are three still on the moon, Apollo 15, 16, and 17. They left those vehicles behind. The conditions on the moon are very difficult. I know that what people say is that the American flags that were left behind probably don't exist. If they are there, they're bleached probably to almost transparent because of the solar radiation. These vehicles might still be runnable. I mean, they were battery powered. They didn't exhaust the batteries at all. They only ran them limited miles. So there is a possibility if you got there, they would still run, but they are located at different points where the astronauts left them. There was a fourth vehicle built that was essentially used for sort of archival purposes. And for testing on Earth, GM and Boeing built what they called a 1G version. It was essentially an earthbound version. It had Goodyear tires on it. It was the exact same vehicle, ran on batteries, had the front and rear steering that the astronauts would use for training purposes on Earth, so they could learn how to negotiate rugged terrain and hills and things like that. So a couple of those test vehicles are still around. But the originals are still on the lunar surface. So,
are there any additional questions?
Mark, I thought the video was fascinating. Really slick, a kind of techno-patriotism with a good old boy spin. Who's the intended audience? Is this a tool to influence the decision-making that you mentioned, or is there some larger audience?
Well, I think that's twofold in and of itself. The key here that Leidos isn't really playing up is the corporate sponsorship connection. One of their main reasons for signing on with NASCAR was, yeah, NASCAR's got technology and it's got innovation and all that kind of stuff, but it also has that strong corporate connection where companies, it's what we've seen in NASCAR forever. NASCAR sells products. Leidos sees NASCAR as being sort of a money magnet and getting that kind of commercial input, especially, as I said, the space program now is becoming much more commercialized and privatized. So, if you're going to compete against the Jeff Bezoses and the Elon Musks, you're going to have a sugar daddy who's paying some of the bills, and the federal government's not going to be able to do it. So there's that idea. But yeah, the video is very interesting, and this is actually the second one they produced. They produced one right about the time of the debut that was, and I actually tried to find that one because that one was laden with sort of historical footage. You know, they showed pictures of Neil Armstrong, and they showed pictures of, you know, the Saturn V, like you see here, but then it was juxtaposed with the next gen car. And there was really no historical quotient. It was just the next gen car and Apollo footage. Now they've kind of backed off and they're doing that whole sort of nostalgic thing. You know, the shade tree mechanic, the race car that's built in a shed out behind the house, and then tying it in to all of that sort of Cold War. And notice it's not, you don't see anything but you don't see anything about NASA other than the moon program, because that's the key here. This vehicle is all about getting the contract to go to the moon. And so yeah, very, very highly sort of, you know, socio-political, technical kind of rhetoric going on.
Any other questions?
Mark, you talk about the commercialization business. General Motors provided Corvettes to the first astronauts, correct?
Yep.
And as a PR stunt, and some of the astronauts became race drivers. I think of Pete Conrad. He raced here in the Toyota Celebrity Race once.
Yeah, well, I remember Pete came here to try to qualify for the 6-hour race, and just fell short. He didn't make it. His time was too slow. But yeah, I mean, there is this GM connection, and GM was a principal player in the original lunar roving vehicle. It's interesting that GM is now working with Lockheed Martin. So they've separated themselves. It's kind of like been there, done that. Leidos really jumped in here, and when they said that they partnered with NASCAR, that, you know, I could see them partner. I mean, I could see a company like Leidos partnering with, let's say, a Formula One team. Because if you're talking technology and cutting edge sort of development, yeah, there you go. But to be sort of saying, well, because of the next gen car, and this whole idea of quick maintenance and, you know, and durability, I can guarantee you if something breaks on this new lunar roving vehicle, the astronauts aren't going to be, they're not going to put it on the crash clock and try to repair the thing. If it stops working, if they can't get it going again, they're just going to ditch it. The Apollo 15 mission almost did that. Dave Scott and Jim Irwin unloaded the lunar rover. They unfolded it, got it together, they hooked the batteries up, and they couldn't get voltage. They couldn't get a reading that there was any power in the batteries. And it took them sort of talking with engineers in Houston to make adjustments and, you know, switch wires and do this kind of thing, and they eventually got it working. But you know, again, it's that whole sort of mythic notion. You know, well, NASCAR is all about, you know, it's bare bond and duct tape and chewing gum, and that's what gets cars back out there, and you can still win races. You know, Dale Earnhardt just about totaled a car. They brought it in, taped it together, and he went back out and, you know, was competitive. We'll see. And we'll see how this contract goes, because they may not even get the contract. It's quite possible that this will fall through. But it's an interesting campaign.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Not so fast. got a break. By some miracle, we have managed to get ahead of schedule. This doesn't happen often. It probably will go downhill soon. So while I have your attention, several things. In the back, direct your attention all the way back here to Mr. Sider. There are a number of books that we have for sale to help sponsor the research center. These were donated by Joe Freeman of Racemaker Press. These are all by Joel Flynn. And let me tell you, the price is very good. All these books at one time were in over $100 and something. Pick one up now for $20 and make us happy. Okay? They're really great books. Get a chance, grab one. Now, before I give you a quick break, a couple announcements I have to make. Those who presenters and invited guests, you'll be eating here. For those who will be going out to lunch, take that how you will. There are a couple of ways, a couple of easy places. If you go down to Route 414, hang a left, the bottom of the hill as you go into the village is Holy Cow. And there's a couple of fast food places to your left down Franklin. And there's, of course, Curly's if you hang a right. Any of those. Because you've only got about an hour and a half, so make it quick. Holy Cow is pretty good. And so is Curly's. So keep that in mind. One of the other things I want to bring up is during the break, socialize. This is what this is all about. This is what all these conferences are about. Symposiums is melding of minds, getting to know other people. For those of you who are online, if you have any questions or comments, please let us know. Again, we can't thank enough of the work that Eric and Grand Touring Motorsports is doing to make this all possible. So right now we're a little bit ahead schedule. In fact, I'm stunned we're ahead of schedule. So we'll take a break. Instead of 15, we'll take about 15 minutes. Please be back in your seats, and we'll be right back with Jim. You're up next, correct? Yeah. Okay. So we'll have Jim, Professor Jim Mille will be our next one up. So thank you. Take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
Folks, try to be back about 10:35. About 10:35. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, let's take our seats. Okay. Our next presentation is by Professor Jim Mille, and it's a very much appropriate one. It's Formula One at Watkins Glen, Circus Days. So Jim, when you're ready.
Thank you. How's the audio? Yes? So I happened to be in Houston last weekend, and I visited NASA, of course, and this Artemis program has a huge promotional exhibit. Like, you know, we're doing it. Get on board. I thought that was very interesting. Yeah. So, sports car racing on the streets and roads of Watkins Glen took place between 1948 and 1955. It was the realization of a fantastic dream of Cameron Argetsinger. And he'd summered on the nearby family farm. Yes, testing, thank you. And learned to drive on these same streets and roads when he was just 12 years old. Argetsinger teamed up with the village mayor, a newspaper man, a garage operator, the owner of the Seneca Lodge, and a bunch of other local business leaders. Racing, they thought, would be fun for the northeastern elite who could afford to do it, and the spectacle would extend the local economic benefits of tourism further into the autumn. Is this a left click? Yes. Thank you. I'm a Mac guy, so this is a new terrain for me. There we are. Yeah, I found it. Yeah, we're fine. Thanks. The races were successful beyond expectations, drawing thousands of spectators. The first permanent track was built in 1956 and a second in 1971. In 1961, Formula One came to stay for 20 years. This presentation is part of a larger historical study of Grand Prix auto racing. Last year, I presented a model of F1's developmental stages with a media orientation and an emphasis on the U.S. Watkins Glen seemed to me to be a worthwhile case study of what I'm calling the circus era, and that'll be my focus today, although I can only skim the surface of what I've learned since last November. Let me begin with three key observations which will help you appreciate the details that follow. First, the 13 years of racing at Watkins Glen very much prefigured the Formula One experience in terms of organization, success, community involvement, sanctioning issues, and financial challenges. My second takeaway is related to the first. F1 at Watkins Glen was a fluke of historical circumstances that came together almost kaleidoscopically. It was at once a logical step in the modernization of Formula One, a remarkable local achievement, and a situation whose apparent strengths were equally the source of its eventual failure, that is, bankruptcy and the loss of the U.S. Grand Prix. A last observation is that there's no denying the importance of F1 at the Glen. Nearly half of all U.S. GPs occurred here. Watkins Glen hosted the race longer than any other American venue. Teams, drivers, the press, fans all agreed on the special charm and beauty of the place, the warmth and skill of race organizers, and the joyous participation of the villagers. It was unique, and also more generally influential in what people call the Watkins Glen effect, meaning encouraging other early circuits like Elkhart Lake, Lime Rock, and perhaps Bridgehampton. Nor is the past forgotten locally. For 30 years, the village has hosted a one-day Grand Prix festival that's a kind of reenactment of those long-ago times. And the Argetsingers family gift of the International Motor Racing Research Center collects and preserves precious materials that document the past, available to anyone. This was a period when F1 began to become something recognizable to our own time. Regular circuits and countries became legacy venues. Familiar teams established themselves. Champion drivers emerged, and there were serious technological advances. The sport also became more commercial, financially dependent on sponsorship, which changed car livery from national colors to corporate and product designs, while new organizations like the GP Drivers Association and the F1 Constructors Association challenged both the authority of the FIA and the independence of local race organizers. It was also an extremely dangerous time when 9 drivers were killed, 2 of them here. These fatalities provoked drivers into a sustained program for safety that improved tracks and race cars. Here's a schematic. Yes. Here's a schematic representation of the Circus era study as it's coalescing. I won't be talking about the media component today due to lack of time. My overall aim in this is to move outside the usual motorsport historiography into a more lived cultural context, a kind of arm's length, sorry, it's my allergy season, a sort of arm's length ethnography. The most abstract and all-encompassing frame here is the carnivalesque. By this I mean a zone of sanctioned fun, but crucially, where inversions of the normal take place, where fantasy becomes reality. So, speeding is prohibited, except here, where it's demanded, where mythical gods turn into superhuman drivers, where everyday safety and security are abandoned in favor of embracing danger, and where celebration without inhibition takes place. Think of the bog. A side note, and there could be many of these, during this period, another related carnivalesque phenomenon, the outdoor music festival, emerged. Holistic leisure, somebody calls it, complete with on-site camping, merchandise, food, and all the rest. In July of '73, there was Summer Jam, featuring the Allman Brothers, the Grateful Dead, the band, and 600,000 rock fans, a record, and it took place here. Calling this the circus era goes beyond an affectionate metaphor. In fact, the circus and the county fair, we've already heard a reference to that this morning, are predecessor cultural forms to Formula One. They afford ready-made structures and cultural practices that racing took as its own. Both are mostly rural and small town. Fairs were meant to educate farmers about the latest agricultural techniques, and that required entertainment to get their attention, which looked a lot like circuses, some version of the rings and the midway. Locals collaborated to maintain an annual fair, and they mixed it up with the exotic outsiders that circuses brought to town. Fairs sought to be community building. Circuses displayed advanced technologies like electric lighting and travel by train. Fairs involved competition, animal building, and canned fruit. Circuses were mobile encampments, while fairgrounds had permanent buildings. Fairs' most popular events included horse racing, which gave way to auto racing with circuits and grandstands. Auto thrill shows were a kind of circus spin-off. There's a great deal more to say about how circuses and fairs foreshadowed automobile racing, and maybe F1 in particular during this period, just not today. Watkins Glen is a rural village whose population during the circus era was about 2,500. People descend mainly from English and Irish immigrants, and there's a sizable Italian community. The area then was mostly agricultural, with a significant salt-producing industry. Situated at the southern tip of Seneca Lake, Watkins Glen has a long history of tourism. Steamboats and the railroad brought the well-to-do to elegant hotels and a spa near a 2-mile-long gorge, which at the turn of the 20th century became a popular New York State park. It was, and it is, a pleasant working-class town of small businesses and modest homes. Its biggest neighbors include Ithaca, home of Cornell, and Elmira, where there's a small airport. There is nothing in any of these rather commonplace features that even hints that someday Watkins Glen would become globally synonymous with the pinnacle of international road racing and produce a 75-year heritage of motorsports. The invention of road racing at Watkins Glen was a top-down affair. It would come to involve the genuine enthusiasm and active support of townspeople, but it was mostly the work of a social elite, men with the experience, education, time, and means to organize, operate, and compete in sports car racing. There was a core of local founders. They were informed by pre-war racing in the US and Europe and savvy enough to gain sanctioning, to close the streets and roads, to stop the trains, to attract contestants and all the rest. Drivers were gentlemen sportsmen with serious money, fame, or both. They might have played polo or sailed in regattas. They tended to drop out of Ivy League schools. They were widely known in popular culture. They had resources for serious play. A modest 1948 MGTC cost twice the price of a basic Ford coupe. Many of them had experienced the Depression in comfort. They all, of course, had survived the war and were looking to live full lives. Some were heirs and were especially influential. The Collier brothers grew up on an estate next to the Rockefellers. The boys built a racetrack out of its service roads. In the years just before the stock market crash, teenage Sam built and ran a summer theater featuring vaudeville and movies. It seated 66 and was financed by his father. The patriarch made his money in streetcar and subway advertising and then bought more than 1 million acres of southwest Florida, where Collier County is named for him. Briggs Cunningham is in a league of his own. His influence on American post-war road racing is probably as immeasurable as his personal wealth. It was Cameron Argetsinger's dream to race cars through the roads where his family roots were generations deep. His father had gone to Ohio, where he became an officer of a Youngstown steel mill. Father and son drove Packards. At age 20, Cameron was co-owner of a Packard dealership. After the war, he was a married father, and between college and law school, he seems to have been able to devote himself to road racing. It would not be unkind to call this a vanity project, one whose success was directly linked to Argetsinger's philanthropy. From the start, he sought to bring Formula One to the Glen. Many teams, as many as 60, circulated through F1 during the Circus era. Maybe 15 could be considered significant. What are today called team principals were then some combination of owner-manager, fundraiser, and designer. Colin Chapman was a university-trained engineer. A number of these owners were former drivers. Bruce McLaren designed, built, and drove his own cars. Sometimes a mother company manufactured road cars whose main purpose was to pay for racing. Ferrari and Lotus are examples. These men shared a single-minded dedication to the sport. Frank Williams called it a lifelong compulsion. Ginny Williams wrote this about her husband of nearly 40 years. I'm quite certain he never visualized himself as one of the world's leading constructors. His motivation was simply his love of Formula One racing. He was addicted, no lesser word will do, to all aspects of the Grand Prix circus. He didn't really mind whether he was on the trapeze or cleaning out the cages, so long as he was there. The owners were idiosyncratic. Williams never ate on race day. He didn't drink or smoke. He was a serious runner, keeping very fit. His future wife loaned him her inheritance, infuriating her father, who stopped Jenny's monthly allowance. Williams barely made his own wedding and lived his first married year without furniture. There were an eviction and a baby at about the same time. His personal driving was so dangerous, he was called a hooligan. Teams often operated on a shoestring and with a DIY mentality. Enzo Ferrari disdainfully called them garagistas. It took Williams a good decade before his team found success. He started by buying and selling used race cars and parts, sharing a London bachelor pad. Creditors circled and mechanics were paid by barter. Ford would loan the team a van, and Frank would sell it for cash. Drivers avoided his team. Maybe out of pity, Ken Tyrrell loaned an engine. But Williams made his team feel like a family. People worked for him for ages. And eventually, of course, during the Circus era, Williams won 11 races and a drivers' and a constructors' championship. Things got only better after that, but running a team was hit or miss then, and teams very much reflected their owners' quirky, impassioned personalities. There's disagreement about who first remarked that F1 drivers are like interchangeable light bulbs, but you see the point. During the Circus era, there were a great many drivers who passed through the sport. Teams then didn't identify, train, and advance them. Careers were short, several years at most, and only a few rose to the glow of celebrity among scores, even hundreds of dimmer bulbs. For most, even those who became stars, a driver's life was often one of struggle and danger. Jackie Stewart was 3 times world champion. Eventually, he ran his own team. He led the successful fight for driver safety. Roman Polanski made a film about him, and George Harrison recorded a single. He provided TV race commentary and was a spokesman for Ford and Rolex. The King of Jordan was Stewart's buddy. Stewart calls his F1 experience and the life it engendered a rocket ship ride. That's because he began as a mechanic in his family's rural garage. Climbing the ladder, he says, I drove whenever, whatever, wherever possible. For his first Monaco race, to save money, he drove the round trip from Scotland. And while he felt he was up against the sons of rich fathers, he referred to death on the track as akin to an air crash and a medieval battlefield. Today's drivers, Stewart says, have no understanding at all of what we experienced. Mechanics are the essential grunts of Formula One. They may be dedicated to their team and enjoy a winning relationship with the driver, but their anonymous life is hard, with 14, 16, and even 18-hour days not uncommon in the past. Steve Matchett, a Benetton mechanic for 8 years during the team's glorious 90s, offers these unromantic recollections. He recalls wearing bubble wrap on his feet during winter testing in the UK, plus a t-shirt, race shirt, sleeveless sweater, heavy knit sweater, duck-down body warmer, and wet weather anorak. The long hours, the all-nighters, and the hectic workloads that we are sometimes forced to endure are terrible facets of work in F1, and at times I felt we were little more than slave labor. Matchett concludes, the reality is this. Formula One, for all its associated passions, is a job of work, another way of earning a living. The Grand Prix Drivers Association gave Watkins Glen its Best Stage Grand Prix Award in 1965, in 1970, in 1972. Ginny Williams said that Watkins Glen was my favorite place in the world. Jackie Stewart remembered the glorious colors of autumn in the Finger Lakes, rural America in the fullest sense, and unlike the other places we'd be traveling to. The teams stayed at the Glen Motor Inn. And because of the Canadian and Mexican races, teams might remain there for 3 weeks. There was a charity golf tournament for drivers. Drivers fished on the lake, and Bruce McLaren water skied. Graham Hill said, "In Europe, we don't stay in the same hotels. We meet only at the racetrack. Here, it's like a party." Well, there were actual parties. Before the race, at the Argetsingers' home, where Bill Green screened race movies in the garage. Looking back, Bill Milliken said, "The homespun hospitality led to permanent friendships and was never forgotten by drivers or teams." There was a post-race party at the Seneca Lodge where Francois Sever would play the piano and James Hunt picked up waitresses. In between, there was a champagne party for drivers' wives and girlfriends. When F1 was finished with the Glen, Rob Walker said, "It makes me very sad to have to go." Local people sold parking places in their yards. Kids sold race tickets to the lines of cars streaming into the track. Church ladies prepared boxed lunches. Concession stands were staffed by locals, and some of that money paid for the annual high school trip to Washington. Ferrari mechanics overheard Italian being spoken in a store, which led them to cooking with the Italian-speaking villager in her kitchen. Before there were proper facilities at the track, dealerships that ordinarily sold Detroit products turned their garages over to the F1 teams, and locals trucked the cars up the hill for the race. Rick Huey's experience with Tyrrell Racing epitomizes the easy collaboration between the visiting circus and the villagers. To put it way too briefly, as a teenager, Rick met Ken. This led to Rick's becoming an invaluable local man Friday. And then for 27 years, at several North American tracks, Rick worked when he could as a Tyrrell team member. Try that today. So what remains to be studied? Well, there is the so-called Watkins-Glen effect, a kind of ripple across U.S. road racing. Local participation was a distinctive feature here. More specific examples would bring this more to life, like names of lodgings and shops that cater to the race crowd, stories about volunteering, memories about F1 cars at places like the Chevy Garage, that sort of thing. But that's a tough challenge to get that kind of information so many years later. And some sort of limited comparison with F1 in Europe during this period would demonstrate either how unusual Watkins-Glen was or how certain Grand Prix qualities were universal. I would just say that there's always more to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Some questions for Jim. Comments?
Thank you very much for that. As a Mount Holyoke graduate, I was very excited to see a Hampshire College
We should
professor.
talk later then.
Yeah. So we talk a lot about the glory days, right? You know, the glory days at Watkins Glen. What are ways that you can see us both preserving that heritage but also adding to it?
Well, I suppose there are different ways to come at that. I mean, my particular interest is here is regarding F1, and I have a broader interest in sports car racing. And you know, and of course NASCAR has been here now for a long time, so there's still racing going on. And the research center, where I've spent many hours, both going through materials and talking with generous people, is this living archive full of material, which just speaking for myself in this project, I now feel a responsibility to bring this to life in some way and publish it and see that it's circulated so perhaps people can remember a past. Maybe the larger question is, you know, is there a future for auto racing as we've known it, which is so that I had this kind of cockamamie model that I presented last year, which suggests that maybe the next chapter in the life of Formula One, at least, might be a kind of a simulated hyper-reality experience where we don't have to go to a race, which actually isn't taking place anyway. Now, that's pretty extreme as speculation. But those would be my initial responses to your question. Thank you.
Anybody else?
July of '73.
Okay, that's interesting because in July of '72, there was a music festival held at Pocono Raceway, and it was about 250,000 people or so showed up, and it was like a Woodstock type of thing.
Right.
And that's just when you said that, and it's like, well, wait a second, Pocono had one as well, so it must just be a commercial endeavor for a facility that takes in lots of people, has a lot of room, can hold campers, and so I just wanted to see the
well, those were the days, and these places are natural sites. The organizers here were serious professionals who had done other very successful gatherings. This got totally out of control, as I understand it. And as in many cases, well, Woodstock would be the prime example, many people paid nothing. They just overwhelmed the place. And my sense is that the local people were very upset by this invasion of 600,000 people.
Well, the Pocono event did as well. Roads were blocked. It was a rainy weekend, so it was mud and a lot of gate crashing.
Yeah.
And again, crippling the community because there was such an influx.
That's right.
Going to the racetrack.
That's right.
So.
Although some of us of a certain age kind of remember those things fondly, but we won't go there.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Two comments. Vintage racing might be another way to help preserve and present the historic race cars. And you've probably heard this. Sam Posey wrote a book, I think it was called The Mudge Pond Express. It's a little hard to find, but it really describes a lot of the escapades that went on back in the day.
Thank you. I haven't read Posey's book, but I live relatively close to Lime Rock, so the strait there is now named after him, and he lives in Sharon, I think. The vintage racing is actually one of the principal activities during the annual Grand Prix Festival here in September. That's a good point. And it happened a weekend earlier annually at Lime Rock. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? You.
Now, Bill, don't challenge any of my historical
No, I'm
facts.
going to tell. What I'm going to tell you is the biggest rock concert was here, bigger than Woodstock and bigger than the one that was in Ontario some years later. And when you came to, I worked here, and so did Rick Huey. Rick was around, and a bunch of us others. But when it came time for Summer Jam, you couldn't go nowheres in Watkins Glen. Montour Main Street was parked full of cars, and there was cars all over the place in Watkins Glen. The only way you could go down through Montour Falls was down South Street out and over the roadway to Burdett and all that. But it was the biggest thing in the world. And then the pickup after that was a lot, too. It was all kinds of things. Cars that would never go back where they had came from. And you'd find money on the ground. Food that was unable to be preserved because they didn't have enough ice. But anyways, Watkins Glen was the biggest one, bigger than the other two that I mentioned.
Thank you. I would just like to say, as the hands continue to go up, how I'm trying to conceptualize a historical moment, and particularly in this place, is convincing to you, and whether you have suggestions for ways to fiddle with it.
Yes, sir. I have to say this, and I hope it's not offensive to anybody, but in answer to the young lady over here, I think we owe Bernie Eccleston for the decline of Formula One racing here at Watkins Glen. And I really regret that
we're moving to venues like Las Vegas, and but money drives the world.
Maybe just to add, Ecclestone then was the leader of the Formula One Constructors Association. He was a Brabham team owner at the time, I think, and his aim was to get a better deal for the teams, and especially lining his own pockets. And my recollection, and others would know this better than I do, is that he in particular put pressure, along with the drivers, on the track for more updated facilities. I think toilets in the paddock might have been one of the issues, as well as safety. So there was this, one of the dynamics going on at the time was a kind of general upgrading that was just too expensive, as I understand it, for Watkins. Would you agree with that? Yeah, thank you.
Keith, thank you, Jim. That was wonderful. That was
My
a
pleasure.
very
Thank
different
you.
look. Thank you. Our next presenter is Professor Mike Stocz. Mike is one of our more important people with the Argetsinger. He's also the Journal of Motorsports History. He's the publisher, editor, chief cook, and bottle washer, I guess. All the above. Mike will be talking about an overview of motorsport podcast focused on women. And by the way, before we get started, some of you have seen this little card. If you little QR code, this will take you to a very interesting place. I'll put it that way. Worth taking a look. Okay, take it away, Mike.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Mike Stocz. I'm from the University of New Hampshire, and today's talk comes by way of a talk that really happened or started last year by my colleague, Dan Simone, back in the back, when Dan came up with a couple of other presenters and started to talk about Title IX, women in motorsports, and things of this sort. One of the things that really stuck with me through last year's symposium and afterwards was, how do we make sure that women find or have space carved out for them within motorsports communities? And me, being one of these sneaky millennials, thought, well, we already probably have a spot for that. And heading back home, I was listening to one of these weird, freaky podcast things, and I thought, you know, there might be something to this. So the idea for this piece of original research kind of spurred from last year's conference. So some previous studies in motorsport that surround women suggest that in a lot of ways, coming back to Danica Patrick, as mentioned earlier by Mark Howell, a lot of media representations of women in motorsport are very over-sexualized, and rarely, at least in popular media, do they go into the finesse, the skills and capabilities therein. Now, in terms of podcasts themselves, podcasts are heard worldwide, can in most situations be downloaded and heard almost free of charge for many different providers. Some, there will be some sort of a fee associated with them. Some have advertisements for them. Really, it's a new phenomenon that occurred just after the turn of the millennium. Now, for the study itself, what I decided to look into was podcast titles, not necessarily individual podcasts themselves, but podcast titles that circled around, namely, women in motorsport. So we'll get to why that's a little bit of a problem later on, but being an academic and how we got here, Some of the background literature surrounding podcasts. Podcasts have been used in a couple of different ways. In particular, sport is one of the most popular venues for podcasts to be housed. Within sport podcasts, some of the previous literature suggests that sport podcasts can be used as a way to bring folks from diverse and, in many instances, repressed, maybe a good term for this, groups socially, economically, or otherwise. Other podcast literature suggests that podcasts today, when we think of K through 12 and even higher education, are being used as ways to help students learn. For example, one of my colleagues has a podcast dedicated solely to adapted physical education, so think Paralympics, Paralympic Games, things of this sort, in which he uses to re-emphasize key points from different lectures, classes, etc., and it has helped out tremendously with retention for his students. Lastly, within sport podcasts in particular, listeners self-identify themselves as listening to podcasts to try and increase their overall knowledge for a particular sport podcast subsect, but B, also self-identify as being higher than your average intellect for a sport fan in that area. So meaning, if somebody were listening to, let's say, a basketball podcast, they would identify themselves as somebody who may know the NBA better than an average fan, something like that. To tie this in somewhat with the ideas I got from Dan's roundtable last year, decided to go with a theory called archival theory, which archival theory is essentially how librarians in particular choose which artifacts, be that books, collections, photography, video, digital media as well, what is represented in their library coffers? What are they spending money on to keep these things around and available for public consumption? One of the main critiques of archival theory is something that we'll talk about a little bit at the end too, this idea called appraisal and how we evaluate one piece of memorabilia or artifact versus another and why we may keep one versus the other. Sternfeld, in particular, decided to expand on archival theory beyond your brick and mortar libraries and suggested that, hey, this wacky internet thing may actually be a good place to expand archival theory and start to look at more of a bottom-up approach of what fans are wanting to listen to or find on the internet, etc. Last off, the women in motorsport literature. Without beating a dead horse too much, very over-sexualized representations of female athletes tended to occur up into and still today, but in particular it was a focal point of the 2010s in literature therein. Now, what we actually did, before we go into what all of these weird-looking phrases are, I want to describe how we got the sample and kind of what that looks like for this study. So again, the sample consisted of podcasts that were under one general title. Sorry, my Italian's coming out, I guess. It falls under one general category that focuses solely on women in motorsport. So what that means is, really there weren't that many podcasts found from a general search of women in motorsport via Google in particular, seeing as how it is still the most popular search engine in the world, and coming from a perspective of not being an intensely listening podcast consumer, meaning that they may be fair weather and just seeing what's out there. Sure, we could have went through and used these same search terms through Google Podcasts, Spotify, and others, but for the way we wanted to attack this was from how a general consumer may try and find this information. So some of the things that are left out, Danica Patrick's podcast that may or may not be conspiracy theory laden was left out because the focal point wasn't necessarily on motorsport. Further, there are a number of different overarching podcast titles that may have a bunch of little subtitles underneath them, okay? So for example, one of them in our data set, Women in Motorsport, hosted a variety of different shows that focused on women in motorsport, but from different angles. Similarly, there are other podcast titles that may have special once a month episodes that focus on women in motorsports. Those were not included in this, mostly because the main focal point, again, wasn't expressed in the title, and it could be a secondary type of interest for the host and podcasters. Now, getting to what's on the slide, what we did and what we found was using the general search term, women in motorsport, we were able to find a whopping, at first it was only 5, then it became 8, then it became 12. But at first, a whopping 5 podcasts that fit a very general Google search criteria. Of the eventually 12 that we would find, we just stuck with the original 5, copied all of the, descriptions from each of the episodes as well as the title, descriptions, etc., the show descriptions, etc., put them in a Word document and did something called an inductive thematic analysis. So essentially what that is, after transcribing all of these things, we went through line by line and inductively reasoned that this line is suggesting X or Y. Afterwards, we went back through the entire data set one more time, went line by line through each of these, combined related terms, and we came up with general overarching themes and some sub-themes therein. Alongside of that data collection, we collected how many episodes were under each title, which, as you can see, vary greatly, from 8 all the way up to 197. From a when these were published perspective, Women in Motorsport was the longest tenured, going back to 2016. All of our data collection ended roughly September of this year. So, average run times, we also kept those as well. Some discussions that I've had with others about podcasts and how long a podcast should be range anywhere from 5 minutes for just quick bits, quick news bits, things of this sort, all the way up to 2 hours if it's an in-depth conversation. Here, we found that the average hovered just below 40 minutes per podcast. Obviously, there were some outliers, some of which included trailers, such as a 30-minute snippet of, hey, tune in when we're going to talk with such and such. Now, some of the results, and some of this may look a little bit weird, but on the left side of each of the following slides are the themes that we generated, myself and a student that helped me out with this named Caleb McChesney. We went through all of the data sets and by ourselves came up with these themes, agreeing, disagreeing at parts, etc. On the far side to me of the screen, stage right, you'll see a bunch of these word bubbles. These word bubbles were put together by a software called Lexamancer. Nowadays, we think of a software such as Chatbot GPT that's been all over the news. Think of Lexamancer as sort of a dumbed-down version of Chatbot GPT. Its main function is to find connections between different words. And the way that we use that, at least in qualitative research, is to help certify that what we're seeing is generally correct. So, from each of these, some of the data points were not sufficient, I will say that, to be really verified via Lexamancer. Well, we could talk about that when we get there. We broke these down into different subsects, being the title and title descriptions, and each of the individual podcast title and episode descriptions. This slide is the overall results of when we put all of the codes together across all of the titles, etc. So the major themes included on-track elements. So here we're discussing racing itself. We're talking about rules. We're talking about results. We're talking about ingenuity, talking with like racers, things of this sort. Career advancement. Career advancement was a very interesting one in that it happened in two different ways. You had racers and administrators within motorsport. We're talking about how they advanced to whatever position that they eventually were in, be it chief engineer, CFO, CEO, things of this sort. And then some of it was career advice and almost like a networking opportunity. Next, we had equity in motorsport. So this theme itself was more positive than it may come out on the slide, in that, sure, there were minor sub-themes that suggested that equity in motorsport might actually be still a toxic environment, but overall, equity in motorsport was talking more so about developmental opportunities, in particular for women. Then we have show elements, which this one goes more into the nitty-gritty of podcasts. So these would be things such as advertisements for an upcoming show, talking about who they would be interviewing. A lot of times we would see the hosts mention things that they were doing. So for example, one of the major sub-themes from a couple of different shows was the hosts would talk about, in particular, F1 for this data set. They would talk about their experiences in going to Formula One race at Silverstone, Miami, and others. Some minor things that we found in particular to the Women in Motorsport podcast were life away from the track. So what were folks doing behind the scenes, which ties in a lot with other more social media-based sport research. A lot of early social media research suggested that people were getting involved, at the time mainly Facebook and Twitter. It's expanded now obviously to TikTok and others, in that folks were getting on these platforms and following sports personalities because they had the chance of interacting with them and seeing what they were like without the helmet on, when they weren't in a car, things of this sort. And then the last one, life advice and struggles. So the one podcast, Women in Motorsport, went on during the pandemic, in which a substantial amount of that data set was geared towards getting folks through the pandemic, and I'm sorry if that brings up bad memories, so we will move on. From the titles, from just the grandiose podcast titles and podcast descriptions, the major themes that emerged from that were inspiration. So a lot of times in this theme that they would talk about why racers, particularly women, would get involved, why the hosts themselves wanted to get involved in this. Podcast elements, which we went over before. Social media, which was more so to help bolster other handles and such as Twitter handles, follow us on particular blogs, or if they had a different host site. And sustainability. Sustainability here meaning green initiatives, things like Formula E, etc. So again, those were just the titles. And now going into the specifics per podcast itself. So the themes that we saw in particular for the Females in Motorsport podcast were show elements, obviously talking about what would happen within this podcast. On-track elements. A lot of times this would talk, data from this portion would talk about things such as the politics of racing. So going behind the scenes of why certain opportunities were given versus not, and then career advancement, which we mentioned previously. Some of the on-track elements were, if we look at the bubble/Lexamancer part, were tied in with STEM initiatives. So some STEM initiatives obviously tied in with sim racing, engineering, etc. For girls on the grid, again, we had show elements, again, what's coming up, who's coming up, things of this sort. One of the most interesting elements from this data set included some of the career development aspects, including talking with and putting forward almost more so than others, administrators within motorsport who were women, including discussions with Sabre Cook, mechanical engineer and racer in the W Series, or former W Series, Renee Winterbottom, who was a data engineer, and Rami Mayer as an engineer for 888 Racing. So this podcast in particular almost went out of its way to find women in these spheres, almost as a way to try and inspire the next generation and show that, hey, women can be involved in motorsport as well. Girls across the grid, this one, this in particular podcast had the least amount of episodes available and published, and was a little bit more relaxed and conversational in tone. So some of the elements that we would see in particular for the show would be discussions about weekend activities, we'll put it that way. We also saw a little bit here of off-track performances and off-track activities circulating around which Formula One racer was dating whom and such. Not really many interviews with that one. Then we had F1R for the girls. This one had many of the same elements that we saw in the beginning, but one of the bigger things that we did see from this one was equity within motorsports. And here we saw more of the negative themes of equity, i.e. inequity, start to pop up. More, we don't have the opportunity to advance in some of these positions. Most of the Formula One or similar drivers' academies are not accepting women for X, Y, and Z reasons, things of this sort. Then the biggest data set was the Women's Motorsport Network, which again had a variety of different shows here. The podcaster themselves would talk with a number of very interesting individuals that were almost motorsport adjacent and more car enthusiast adjacent. So for example, the host would talk, and here we're talking more like show elements is where we coded this as, would talk to, for example, a jeweler who would take cars from her husband's garage that were completely totaled and would make jewelry out of the wreckage and try to paint it from factory original colors as well. So there was a lot of ingenuity there. We also saw, in particular from this data set, more girls, i.e. under age 18-year-olds, getting involved not only as drivers, but also in administrative roles, such as doing things like play-by-play color commentary, calling the race, in one instance, an engineer. So in this data set, we saw a lot of very unique things. Life advice and struggles, we went over a little bit in the beginning, so I won't hammer that one to death. Okay, so we got all this data, so what does this suggest? At the start of this project, to be very blunt, I thought that most of the podcasts would turn out extremely negative. But overall, the vibe, if you will, was extremely positive, minus a few instances. Within archival theory, just being an academic for a second, we can see how in certain podcasts, in particular the ones that had the most episodes and were running the longest, we can almost see appraisal working in action. Appraisal here meaning, again, how we evaluate one artifact versus another, how we evaluate one podcast versus another. The longevity very much suggests that they will still be around and that there is a fair amount of interest from listeners. So a little bit of a deviation from previous sport literature that involves women. It was our data suggested that there was a lot more talk around the technical aspects of the sport. Some of the other technical aspects not already overviewed. We talked about engineering a fair amount, but different race aspects too, and development. Things that we haven't necessarily seen in other sport-related literature. And that there needs to be some sort of a push for greater access. We did see that in particular with STEM. Again, a little bit of a negative connotation, but it was usually coupled with some sort of positive aspect. Implications and future research. One of, again, the biggest limitations for this study was that we weren't able to capture every little bit of women and motorsport related podcasts, be it individual episodes or even show titles. This limitation is more systemic and goes back to podcasts themselves. Within podcasts, you cannot necessarily put in what we call search engine optimization terms. In other words, how Google finds certain websites and other elements. Those have not been fully integrated into podcasts as of yet. Now, the podcasts that we did find that didn't directly match the search term usually had a separate web page that worked as a housing unit that linked you to, here's where our podcasts are available on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and others. In future research and in continuing with this, obviously getting those little remnants and finding out what's going on in more of your one-off type episodes as well as the little bit harder to find podcasts would absolutely be necessary. And to wrap up, one other consideration that we could have is interviewing or doing some sort of survey with podcast hosts or, if available, their audiences to find out from a uses and gratifications lens why they find equity in listening to these podcasts and such. Here are the giants that I stood on to justify my study. With that, we'll open it up for questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. Questions, comments? Oh, we got some.
I feel somewhat qualified to ask this question.
Please.
So I noticed you obviously focused on podcasts that entirely focus on, women in motorsports. Do you think that perhaps if we are looking at, where women have come, that maybe it's time to shift towards a focus on women as drivers, women as mechanics, not just for the sake of, women as women.
Right, right. And yes, I totally 100% agree with you that we need to be focusing on the content of the competitor as opposed to their gender or sex. Absolutely, 100%. And I think a lot of the literature that came out at the end of the 2010s suggested as such across all sporting types, not just motorsport, for sure.
And one of the reasons Janet Guthrie, Denise McCluggage were so successful is they view themselves as drivers first. But I would say, obviously very interesting research. I'd love to see not just the cause, but also the effect looked into. So who are these podcasts reaching, right? Who's actually, watching these podcasts? Is it younger women? Is it, women from their 30s to their 50s? Sort of, what is the actual quantifiable success of these podcasts in getting women actually involved in motorsport and not just sort of, tokenized?
Okay. So heard a couple of different questions there. This study being qualitative, qualitative research is more exploratory, if you will, right? So we're trying to break some ground in some area that hasn't really been looked at because we don't know what's going to happen. So for the who watches or watches if it's a video one, definitely one of the future research areas could be surveying audiences for these major podcast titles for women in sport. That's where you would get the how do you identify, age bracket, all of those like census questions that we all love taking so much, right? So that would be one way that we could look into it. In terms of involvement and actionable items to get more women involved in sport, that one definitely goes way beyond podcasts. I will definitely say that. But I will say that podcasts probably will play at least a minor role in getting more women involved moving forward, in particular with the popularity of podcasts for your 2 to 17-year-old audiences. Thanks for the questions.
Any others?
All right, thanks again, everybody, for your time.
Thank you, Mike. That was great. I hope people understand one of the areas, and I think Mike and some of the others that have spoken in our previous ones and will coming up, is there's fertile ground inside this little niche of history for academics to scrape away and start looking and doing analysis. That's one of the areas that I like what Mike does. They have looked at some areas that are very unusual outside of the normal how people look at these things. And I think that's the sort of ground that we're trying to break here at the symposium. We really think this is important. Sometimes it's down rabbit holes. Sometimes you find Bugs Bunny. Sometimes you find some really neat stuff. But if you don't try to go down the rabbit hole, you're not going to find anything. Our next speaker, Professor Paul Baxa, Ave Maria University. I'll have to say this for Paul. In 2015, when we finally decided to have a symposium and got it going and went through all the rigmarole, we had response from Dr. Doug Layton, University of Toronto. We had a fellow military historian, which I knew, David Charters, out in New Brunswick area. And then Dr. Pat Young and Patricia Young and I were like, we need a third person. So Pat and I were going to basically flip a coin. The person who lost would do the paper, and the person who didn't lose would be the moderator. Then out of the heavens, literally from Ave Maria University, came Paul. So I have a great appreciation for Paul, and I'm glad he's back. And I'm looking forward to this presentation. So Paul, thank you. I get emotional about this, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Don. It's a great pleasure to be back. It's been about 5 years, so I'm really happy to be back with you again. It's great to see how the symposium has grown so much over the years. During the running of the 1938 Miglia, an accident killed 10 spectators, including several children. One day later, the Italian newspapers ran a press release from the Italian government that read, quote, "With the 12th edition, which has cost many lives, the cycle of the Mille on the ordinary roads of metropolitan centers is finished." With this short statement, Italy's most important motor race seemed to be over. First run in 1927, the Mille had quickly become one of Italy's 3 major sporting events, next to the cycling Giro d'Italia and the soccer championship. Unlike these other events, the Mille was a unique product of the fascist era that claimed to embody fascist values and played a key role in promoting Mussolini's regime as one of modernity and technological progress. The sudden pulling of the plug thus came as a surprise, considering that 10 years previously, a similar accident during the Italian Grand Prix at Monza had killed over 20 spectators. On that occasion, the fascist regime rejected calls to ban motor racing, claiming that accidents and loss of life were the price paid for progress and a reminder that fascism was all about living dangerously. By 1938, however, circumstances had changed. Back in the 1920s, Mussolini was in the process of installing a dictatorship whereby fascism was promoted through its violent and dynamic nature. Motorsport proved an effective vehicle for fascists eager to demonstrate the new Italy that they wanted to create. In 1938, fascism was now in its regime phase, where it needed to protect its firm grasp on Italians. One of the regime's persistent claims was that the Mille proved fascism's ability to bring discipline and order to the Italian peninsula. The fact that the race had never had such an accident in its previous editions was a point of pride for a regime that was now firmly established. The accident at Bologna threatened to give the lie to these claims. Therefore, the race needed to be axed. In a certain sense, the Mille was a victim of its own success. The fact that no serious accident had ever occurred before 38 allowed the regime to boast that fascism had imposed discipline on Italians and that the new roads facilitated increasingly powerful racing cars to compete safely on open roads. When the race was first conceived in 1927, it was intended to be a test of endurance for Italian-made touring cars. The organizers hoped that the race would not only stimulate the Italian automotive sector, but also encourage the state to keep improving the country's road network. It didn't take long for the event to become all about speed and the latest high-performance technology. As early as the second edition in 1928, several cars were supercharged, a technology that most automakers were still reluctant to use for regular touring cars. By the mid-1930s, the winning cars of the Mille were nothing more than thinly disguised Grand Prix cars. As the race grew in popularity, it became a contest between Grand Prix aces like Tazio Nuvolari and Achille Varzi, driving competing Alfa Romeos. In the meantime, fascism's cult of speed and progress was given full expression in a race that attracted celebrities and political figures. The fascist party secretary was the honorary starter, and key figures in the regime appeared at the Rome checkpoint. Mussolini donated a cup in his name for the driver able to cover the Brescia to Rome leg in the fastest time. In 1936, defying the League of Nations embargo on Italy due to the Ethiopian War, the race was promoted in the service of autarky, with some cars using alternative fuels. The sudden death of the Mille Miglia in 1938 thus ended an event that was important to fascism's self-image and a blow to Italian motorsport, at a time when Italian cars were being trounced on the Grand Prix circuits by the Silver Arrows. Therefore, the Mille Miglia had to be revived in some new shape or form. An alternative was floated for a race to be run in the Italian colony at Libya, but this would have taken it far away from Brescia. Ultimately, a solution was found to hold a 9-lap race on closed public roads linking Brescia, Cremona, and Mantova on a circuit measuring 165 kilometers, or 102.5 miles. The date chosen for the race was April 28, 1940. In the run-up to the event, the organizers needed to convince the motorsport community that this edition, despite its obvious difference to the previous races, was a new and revived Mille Miglia. It also needed to persuade the regime that the fascist values embodied in the classic event would be maintained. In short, the Mille Miglia had to be reinvented as a sporting and as a political event. The 1940 Mille Miglia is an anomaly. To begin with, it was officially called the first edition of the Gran Premio di Brescia, which you can see on the poster of the event. A title that could easily lead people to believe that this was an inaugural race and not a continuation of a classic race. Furthermore, one of the race's original organizers, Giovanni Canestrini, refused to be involved with this new event. As well as being one of the legendary Four Musketeers who invented the race, Canestrini was also Italy's leading motorsport journalist. It was largely through his reporting in the Gazzetta dello Sport that the Mille Miglia was elevated to legendary status. Canestrini never considered the 1940 race to be a legitimate Mille Miglia, writing in his 1967 memoir that holding the race on a closed course betrayed the spirit of the classic event. Despite this denunciation, Canestrini did include the results of the race, in the appendix of his book, as well as some photographs, thus recognizing it as an official Mille Miglia, despite his own personal views. Canestrini's views contributed to the debate on what constituted the essence of the Mille Miglia. For him, it was the figure-of-8 open road course that covered half of Italy. Many in Italy would have agreed that this was the race's most distinctive feature. The challenge for the organizers was to convince the public that the new edition was legitimate, despite the sacrificing of its most notable feature. This would prove difficult, since the race's original justification in 1927 was that the Mille Miglia was reviving the old open road races that had ended with the disastrous Paris-Madrid race of 1903. It didn't help matters that the official race program since the early 30s included large inserts on the famous cities that the race passed through, such as Florence, Rome, Bologna, and Venice. The Mille Miglia had effectively become motorsport's version of the cycling Giro d'Italia, the only difference being that the course did not change much from year to year. Photographs of the race included important landmarks, such as the Piazza Michelangelo in Florence or the Piazzale Milvio in Rome. The course also served to highlight public works projects carried out by the fascist regime, such as the Littorio Bridge in Venice, which connected Venice to the mainland, and the spectacular complex of fascist architecture around the Piazza Vittoria in Brescia. The ill-fated 1938 race even included a lengthy stretch of the new autostrada connecting Florence to the sea, a feature that accounted for the sharp increase in that race's average speed. Like the classical editions, the new race was also designed as an international event, a fact complicated by the circumstances of war. In the past, the race enjoyed entries from Germany, Great Britain, and France, among others. In the spring of 1940, Germany was at war with both Britain and France, and Fascist Italy technically belonged to the Axis, albeit in a non-combatant role. Therefore, it was a difficult proposition to get those countries to send participants. Moreover, the German entries put intense pressure on the organizers to ban British and French cars from the race. Determined to maintain the race's international status, the Brescian Automobile Club withstood the pressure and accepted 2 French délage entries. Although no British entries materialized, the esteemed motorsport writer W.O. Bradley, a fan of the race from its beginnings, showed up only to face harassment from the Germans who were staying in the same hotel. So how did the 1940 edition of the Mille Miglia become part of the official canon of the classic race despite its anomalous character? In the rest of this paper, I'll demonstrate the extraordinary lengths taken to reinvent the familiar race and place it in line with the previous 12 editions. What will become clear is that this reinvention was not only on a sporting level, but also a political one, and how those two, the sporting and political, could not be separated, a fact that characterized the race from its very beginning. As I've argued in my book on fascism and motorsport, the Mille Miglia was a fascist artifact. Indeed, fascism was imprinted into the DNA of the race. From its origins, fascism indulged in a cult of speed and danger. A fetish for fast cars was common to both cultural strands that fed into Mussolini's movement, futurism and Gabriele D'Annunzio's decadentism. This strong cult of speed was reflected in the regime's enthusiastic support for motor racing, a fact appreciated by foreign observers like Bradley, who praised Mussolini for making races like the Mille Miglia a reality. He also praised the regime for disciplining Italians, right? Imagine that coming from a British writer in a British magazine. The Mille Miglia served fascism in several ways. First, it was a showcase for Italian industry. Second, it provided the regime an opportunity to brag about the discipline of the Italian people and to highlight its public works projects. Third, it became a vehicle to propagandize the regime's initiatives such as autarky or national economic self-sufficiency. Fourth, it transformed half of Italy into a giant autodrome where the world's fastest sports cars could shatter speed records and indulge in the cult of speed on ordinary roads. Finally, the regime could claim that it was returning motorsport back to its heroic, pioneering days of the open road, city-to-city races when Italian cars were often major protagonists. And it could do all this without the massacres of those previous races until 1938, of course. The task of the Royal Automobile Club of Brescia was to somehow reinvent the race in a new form while remaining faithful to these characteristics. In the new race, they believed to have found the answer. The case for this was made by several leading motorsport journalists in the pages of the official race program. Once again, the race was promoted as a return to origins, only this time, the origins were the first motor races held in Italy, in and around Brescia. In fact, the new layout was a copy of the 1904 and 1905 Coppa Florio races, as shown in this illustration from an Italian newspaper. While the landmarks of the great Italian cities no longer figured on the route, the course traversed a landscape rich in memories of the Risorgimento Wars of the 19th century, a fact emphasized in the race program. With Italy only a few weeks away from entering the war, which of course no one knew publicly, the race thus hoped to stoke patriotic feelings through memories of Garibaldi and King Victor Emmanuel II. The revived Mille was planned to showcase Italian automotive engineering at a time when German cars dominated the Grand Prix circuits. Of the 12 editions of the Mille held previously, Italian cars had won all but one of them, the exception being in 1931 when Rudy Caracciola drove a Mercedes SSK to victory. This was a race that Italian machinery won on a consistent basis, and with war looming, it was important to demonstrate Italian technology, a fact raised by several writers in the program. Moreover, Alfa Romeo, which had won 10 editions of the race, had made an official return to racing in 1938 with Alfa Corse, and were eager to return to the pinnacle of the sport. Besides Alfa Corse, the entry for 1940 was stacked with Lancias and Fiats in the lower national sport categories. The race also included two exciting new entries from ex-Alfa Corse director Enzo Ferrari. One of these cars, officially called the 815, would be driven by Alberto Ascari, son of the legendary Antonio. And in this photograph, you'll notice that it was taken with the Autostrada in the background, and there's a monument figuring prominently with a quotation from Mussolini bragging about having built the first Autostrade. The Autostrada is still there today. The monument is not. A greater challenge came with highlighting public works projects like this. The one consistent site was the Piazza Vittoria in Brescia, which continued to serve as the race's paddock and scrutineering zone. Inaugurated in 1932 by Mussolini, the piazza was a large public square surrounded by monumental fascist-style buildings designed by the regime's main architect, Marcello Piacentini. It included Italy's first skyscraper, the so-called Torrione, which featured prominently on Mille promotional materials, which you can see on that poster to your right. The headquarters of the Automobile Club were located in one corner of the piazza, and from its balconies were draped the flags of the competing nations. Prominently displayed near the swastika and the Italian flag was the flag of France, a fact insisted upon by race director Renzo Castagneto after facing pressure from the Germans to remove it. In the absence of significant landmarks and fascist sites, the race program made much of the new link roads designed to circumnavigate the major cities of Cremona and Mantova. In the case of the former, the race program exalted the speed and decisiveness shown by the city government in getting a new road built north of the city. And you can see in a Google Earth image on the right that that curving road is still there. That roundabout obviously was not there in 1940. According to the article, the idea for the road came from Roberto Farinacci, the notorious Ras of Cremona, a firebrand fascist who was one of Italy's most vociferous supporters of the alliance with Nazi Germany. Embodying the ideal of the zealous, speed-obsessed fascist, Farinacci had competed in a few editions of the Mille and also been the patron of the Cremona Grand Prix back in the 1920s, which I think at the time was the fastest closed public road circuit in that era. The completion of the new road took only 135 days from its announcement in November 39 to its inauguration in April 1940. Not surprisingly, it was designed as a fast and long, gently banked curve. To make up for the paucity of monuments, the organizers decided to add their own. On the start-finish line, just outside of Brescia, 3 large grandstands were erected, as well as a high control tower, echoing the tower in the Piazza Vittoria. Across the track stood Castagnetto's pride and joy, a massive scoreboard designed by the local architect Tito Brusa. The whole complex, which could be seen from afar, cost the organizers some 4 million lira, with the cost being shared by the club, the local fascist party, and the municipal and regional governments. Included in this cost was a parking lot for 5,000 vehicles, a restaurant, and a fairground. Next to the swastika flags in the Piazza Vittoria, these constructions appeared in most of the widely circulated photographs of the event. The war circumstances provided some propaganda value for the regime. Some of the authors in the program noted how an international sporting event like this could be a herald of peace, or it could demonstrate Italy's preparedness for a possible future entry into the conflict. Corrado Filippini, one of Italy's top motorsport journalists, reminded readers that this event could once again exalt the warrior nation that the Mille Miglia first demonstrated in 1936 during the Ethiopian War. The program's lead editorial promised that this new Mille Miglia will be, quote, a great battle that will present to the world fascism's affirmation of power and organizing perfection, end quote. Furthermore, it was urgent for Italy in this difficult time to promote its industrial and technological efforts. And that too is a quote. All of these reasons suggested that the reimagined Mille Miglia could suit the race's traditional role as a promoter of fascist Italy and its values. But did it really capture the essence of the classic race? For the race to achieve its sporting and political objectives, it needed to express what the Mille Miglia had ultimately boiled down to: speed, endurance, and distance. And this is from the race program in 1940. It's a page showing all the previous editions with the results, but the most prominent feature, which might be hard to see, but it's bolded, is the average speed, right? Because that's what they bragged about. You know, every year it got faster and faster. According to Aldo Farinelli, motorsport columnist for La Stampa and former participant in the race, the new Mille Miglia proved to be an evolution and not a revolution on this score. The old figure-of-8 layout had served its purpose, but a point had been proven with the improvement of Italy's roads, and it was no longer necessary to send race cars out onto those roads. While the old course still appealed to nostalgics, the Mille Miglia was about speed, and the old course, despite its improvements, still provided too many obstacles for the ever-increasing speed of the cars. In contrast, the new layout, though still held on public roads, exalted speed through its triangular shape and fast corners, which avoided crowded urban centers. The long straights and newly paved sections of the course promised a dramatic increase in the race's average speed, which you can see there in those two text boxes. You have the average speeds from 27 to 38, and then the big jump, not surprisingly, in 1940. The new course, argued Renato Tomasini, quote, preserved the fundamental prerogatives of the old race while removing its unnecessary dangers. Ultimately, the Mille Miglia represented an idea and a spirit that could not be left to die simply because the old course had become inadequate. For Aldo Farinelli, the spirit of the race was found in technological progress that could hopefully lead to a more peaceful future in spite of the current winds of war. While others admitted that some of the legendary aura of the classic race would be lost, this was a necessary sacrifice to keep the idea alive. Furthermore, the race would be an improvement for spectators who could now watch the race in its entirety from the new grandstands. For those concerned that the new track was nothing more than a Grand Prix circuit, Farinelli countered that the length of the track was in no way comparable to the artificial character of an autodrome. In its essence, the Mille Miglia came down to speed and less to competition between drivers and cars. In other words, it didn't really matter who won the race, driver or car-wise. It was the only thing that mattered was that average speed. On this layout, the Mille Miglia could continue to strive towards that ideal of ever-increasing speed records. So, in conclusion, the race was run on an overcast day on April 28, 1940, in front of a large crowd. 88 cars started the race grouped into 5 national sport classes. The winner was a streamlined BMW 328 driven by Walter Baumer and Huschka von Hanstein, who led from start to finish and were never seriously challenged. The car was part of a BMW team that was, in the words of one writer, organized like a paramilitary machine. Despite being in the smaller 2000cc class, the Germans were able to beat the more powerful but heavier Alfa Romeo teams. The 2 815s, entered by Enzo Ferrari, showed promise before they both retired. As for the one French Delage entry, it had to be run by an Italian crew and with Italian drivers, as the French crew had to remain in France, waiting imminent call-up to the colors. The car barely lasted a lap before catching fire. Perhaps a foretaste of what was going to happen just a few months later to France itself. Although the race did not provide much in the way of excitement, it did provide a massive jump, as expected, in the average speed and showcased several streamlined cars heralding the aerodynamic age in racing car design. Although the race was successful in attracting a crowd and an international field, it also proved to be the sporting equivalent of what the German armies were accomplishing on the battlefield. The large Nazi contingent that accompanied the BMW team were on full display, and the single most famous photograph is of the race winners waving to the crowd. Featured prominently on von Hanstein's racing overall was the symbol of the SS. In this way, it can be said that the new Mille had actually become, was really the Axis Grand Prix, and thus did in fact maintain its character as a fascist, but also Nazi artifact. Thank you. I'll be glad to take some questions.
Thank you, Paul. Great. Here you go.
Hi. So you have a number of allusions to the media placing the race in the context of fascism and the politics of the period. Did you encounter any evidence or stories of drivers, manufacturers, or national organizations also trying to make that contextual understanding of fascism in the race, for it or against it, or other postures?
Well, I think the photograph of the 815, I think, is a good example. And that wasn't the only car photographed on that spot. All the entries, the Italian cars, were photographed on that spot. So I think that's definitely one. I know that the German BMW team did certainly take this event seriously. Again, they brought the whole kind of Nazi sporting apparatus with them. And, you know, the prominent flags with the swastikas and the Italian flag certainly did that. Oh, I didn't see any pushback because, again, I focused on the Italian media mostly. And even the one British journalist that was there, Bradley, was actually in favor of what fascism had done. And you have to remember, too, that at this point, fascist Italy was not yet in the war. And so some of the British and French could still admire, to some extent, Mussolini's regime without worrying about, being treasonous. But that would end a few weeks later, because on June 10th, Italy came into the war. So, but I didn't see any pushback. Yeah.
Any other questions?
In fact, if I could just finish with that, sorry. I did see an editorial by Charles Faroux, who was the great Belgian motorsport writer for the French paper L'Auto. He had a write-up on it, and there was no political commentary or criticism at all from him. It was just a sporting event. So, thank you.
You described an interest in internationalism that seemed to have internal contradictions and conflicts. And although you didn't explore wider coverage, I'm wondering to what extent this did have international importance. Was it in fact received elsewhere as a kind of expression of successful modernization and so on in Italy?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, I mean, all the Italian newspapers celebrated it. But again, you have to take that with caution because, well, I mentioned I mentioned the Faroux article, and he certainly was very pleased with the event. Charles Faroux, if you're not familiar with him, was probably the deacon of Continental motorsport riders, and he was a big fan of the Mille Miglia. So you might have expected maybe some criticism, but I didn't see it in his article. And so I think there was generally favorable reviews on it because it involved French entries. For those who are still thinking that Mussolini might be able to negotiate. And I mean, this is April 1940, so Germany had just invaded the Scandinavian countries. But you still had a kind of a phony war atmosphere. So I think it was received as some of these writers said, a possibility of a future peacetime event. But of course, this would be the last motor race held up in Italy.
Were there any American entries, and how did they finish? No.
In this race, no. I didn't see any American entries. No, they were just the Germans, the Italians, and the 2 French cars. Well, one of the French cars only ended up racing, and again, didn't last a lap. But I didn't see any Americans. In Italy? I actually conducted research at the Mille Miglia Museum in Brescia, which is a wonderful museum, but it's not easy to get into their archive. You have to write ahead several months beforehand, and they get the stuff for you. So you tell them what you want, and they'll give it for you. But they gave me some beautiful reproductions. So yeah, I did research there. I also did research in the city archives of Brescia as well. And the municipal and the state archives in Rome as well. So I found some material there. But a lot of my research also comes from the Revs Museum in Naples, Florida, which is a good repository of documents. Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Now for the high, no, not the high point of the day, but now we're going to break for lunch. And like I said, those who are presenters or invited guests, you know, we have it here. For those who need to go downtown, you got a few extra minutes since we're a little early. Don't forget, just go out, hang a right, get to 414, and the Holy Cow is right at the bottom of the hill. And there's a couple of places either side. Curly's is one, and a couple of Burger King and whatever. So we can get back and start it a little early. That would be wonderful. I don't have my hopes up, but if we can shoot for it.
Let's try for 1:45.
Somewhere along in there.
Yeah, 1:45, folks. That'd be 10 minutes early. That'll give our McPherson friends a little more time because they have 3 people making a presentation.
Bon appetit.
1:45 instead of 1:55, you still have an hour and a half. Thank you.